This call is the Microsoft Identity Platform call.
This is the link for the preceding session. I recommend you go watch it if you had missed the previous one. The topics that we had covered in those sessions were that I introduced you to Microsoft Graph as you should know, as you should know as a developer. And we gave you some reasons why we built it. We discussed some of the common scenarios that app developers could benefit from when they're using Microsoft Graph. We discussed a bit about how applications are developed, their topology. We discussed permissions and consent in more detail. We discussed the various SDKs that are available to make your development job easier. And we discussed the most common patterns that common app patterns that you would be running into when your applications are trying to interact with Graph. Then we had shared some code and walked through that code which you could use to manage users in your tenant. And then before we ended the last session, we provided you with a big picture where we explained to you how Graph is more than just a database of sorts for all the data that is available in the Microsoft properties for your tenant or for your customers. And this session is generally focused on the aspects which go beyond just Microsoft Graph being a database available via REST API. So just to quickly again walk through, this is how we presented Graph to you, a source of a lot of data that you have that is present out there in Microsoft for your applications to consume and build upon. We explained the concept of what a single API is, and then we discussed how you should start with the Graph Explorer, and then we explained the app topology, which is how the app developer has to think about when they think about developing an app, and what is the topology that we are looking for in terms of how to get an application working with Microsoft Graph. We discussed the various application types and permissions in detail, and the difference between a delegated and an app permission and what an effective permission is. And there was one question that I had from the previous session, which is that I presented how scopes are used, but it would have helped if there was a screen that summarized the whole concept of scopes as well. So I have just added this extra slide, which summarizes how scopes are used in applications when you are requesting for an access token. So the scopes, because in Azure AD we now support what's called as a dynamic scope, you can actually use request individual permissions. So let's say if you wanted to just use request calendars.read or mail.send, or if you're using msol library, you can actually skip the https graph.microsoft.com prefix and just use the actual permission name. These are separated by a space, or there is a different way of, or the older way of requesting access tokens with scope, which is to use the /.default. Those of you who are used to defining your permissions in the API permissions blade, or if you are building applications which are of daemon or a Windows service in nature, or in other ways they will not sign in any users and access the application, access Microsoft Graph as an application itself, you would be using the .default scopes, and you have to define the permissions beforehand. Okay, and this also helps you to record all consent. Let's say if you have in one go. So let's say if you have, if you need the tenant administrator to come in and consent for all the permissions, it would be, if you use the default scope, they would be able to consent for all permissions in one go. It becomes a little clumsy if you are using dynamic consent, is because the tenant admin has to go through all of those scenarios which will trigger consent before they can finish consenting for all the scopes that you will eventually need. And we walked through the SDKs, since we will be talking through these SDKs in especially the Graph SDK in detail in this session. I'm going to just mention them once more. MSOL is our library for authentication. Graph SDKs, it would be our chosen SDK for all the operations that we will carry out with Microsoft Graph. And we discussed this for a while in detail in the last session. It's really, really easy to make use of Microsoft Graph using the SDK. It's not just that it hides the complexity of the REST API. It also supports a lot of extra features that developers would have to consider themselves, like supporting retry handling when they are throttled, and it will automatically know how to process a lot of or let's say, let me put it another way, it knows how to optimize calls to a lot of these workloads which are allowed, which allow things like traffic between themselves. I'll cover that in a detail in another slide. The other one more thing, because Graph is available on production, which is v1.0 and /beta endpoints, there is a different SDK available for both of them. Now, the Graph SDK available for the beta endpoint is not a SDK in beta, it's a production SDK, except that it actually helps if you have APIs that are only in the beta endpoint and you don't want to wait for those APIs to progress to the production endpoint and you want to develop your application, you can start with the beta SDK and then move to the and change your code a bit to accommodate the API when it becomes when it goes to production. You can use both their SDKs in the same project. Please look up the link for the beta SDK. They have instructions on how to use the beta SDK for both the beta and the 1.0 SDK in the same project. Then the library that we had introduced was there is a small wrapper library that the Graph SDK team wrote to make the job of getting the authentication even easier for developers who are using Graph SDK. This is still pre-release, works very well. I would advise you give it a try. It reduces just one line of code, but I find it quite useful. At this point, I'll just stop and see if you have any questions. There is something we are going to roll out early next year where you can choose which security groups your application wants to be available in the tokens. Today, limits of 150 have and 200 have been a source of issues. But yeah, there is something we can, if you can put a question on Stack Overflow and send it to me, I'll answer it for you. Okay, send the link to me on Twitter or somewhere. Any more questions?
One quick question. Is it applicable to both Azure AD, B2E and B2C?
The Graph SDK covers everything in Microsoft Graph. B2E, if you have a guest user scenario, it will still work. B2C has started to support Graph in a little way, but yes, it works for B2C as well.
Okay, and then one more question, and then I think we'll hold a couple more. What is the connection with these Microsoft Graph discussions and Microsoft's formal efforts with respect to digital identity and decentralized identity and self-sovereign identity?
No, so these are discussions around identity in general. I would keep them separate from Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph is more about how to build data-rich applications with data available in Microsoft. So different types of identities are a discussion which is more relevant towards Azure AD in general and the feature it provides in terms of identity management. The fact that we have a good number of features and support built for Microsoft Graph is just one of the hundreds of different features that Azure AD provides. But how the identities are managed and how one of these ways these identities can be applicable to Microsoft Graph are actually two separate discussions.
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and move on. And yes, this call is the Microsoft Identity Platform call. We do have another call that's specific to general Microsoft Graph. And so I can put that link in the IM window for you guys for not specific to the identity side.
Okay. Is the set of MSAD B2C graph, the B2C support for China is being rolled out today, nowadays. it should be available soon. I don't have a date, but I know that the deployment is in progress. Let's start on the second topic here, which is part 2 of it, where we discuss the advanced aspects of Microsoft Graph for developers. What would we cover here? The objective is to harness the power of Graph API beyond just the REST API. We had a simple example that we had covered where we created, updated, deleted a user. We'll just go beyond and see what are the other things that you should be aware of, and nicely taken care by Graph SDK, but it's good for you to know. We will also build more resilient, performant, and fault-tolerant applications. So we will discuss throttling, error handling, and some of the aspects of subscriptions management that would also help you when you are developing a much complex and richer application. The topics that we will cover is that we'll just start with Graph SDK again with a little bit of focus on the advanced features, which would be paginations. This is something that I will cover the first, is because it almost always catches the developers by surprise. Then we will discuss some of the optimizations that are available for developers who are making regular calls to make their applications a lot more performant. We will have a demo of change tracking, which is how to use Delta queries and notifications, which is the other word for that is webhooks, to build applications which can be notified when a data that of their liking has changed in the graph. Then we will discuss support for batching, and we will discuss throttling and error handling a bit. And then if time permits, I will cover the graph extension, but it's a topic that I at least want to mention here so that the session is complete in terms of coverage for Microsoft Graph. Going forward, these are so I will be walking through 2 separate applications today. I have provided a set of links here. So the first one is, if those of you who have not managed to get Azure tenant for themselves, it's highly recommended you don't use your company's own enterprise tenant for development and testing purposes, because you would end up changing data if you have the right permissions, which might be catastrophic for your company. The code from the previous session is shared in the first link. I would be developing an application, and I would be using one of the existing samples for my demo on change notifications. I would suggest you download the sample from GitHub, and if you want to walk with me through while I'm doing the demo, that would be quite helpful. I would also use a tool called Grog for reverse proxying. So when you are developing an application which is going to stand up a listener for receiving notifications, you would ideally use an Azure Functions or an app service or a web application that is available on the internet. But here we have only applications running as a local host, and this tool helps us set up a bridge between my local machine and the internet. So it's a free tool. I recommend you use it. It's very nice when it works for you. The code that I would be using for this session, which is an updated code from my previous session, is also available in the last link. You can keep it handy if you want to follow me while I'm doing all of my demonstrations here. Okay, so the one other question we keep getting asked is like, okay, if I want to build an app, what is the recommended way I should go about building one? The recommendation that we provide is that you first use Microsoft's the Graph Explorer and the documentation to locate all the APIs you need to call. When you're doing that, you would also locate all the permissions that these API needs. So you will have a list of permissions that your application needs to have before you can start making calls to these APIs. So once you have these 2 ready, go ahead and register your app with the Microsoft Identity Platform, that's Azure Active Directory. Configure the permissions for your application, and you would have the list of permissions you need by now. Use MSOL the MSOL library to sign in and get a token for Graph. And then you should either use Graph SDK, which is our preferred approach, or you can call the REST APIs directly with that access token that you just received. So lots of talking. What I would do now is that I will start with building the application again. So we will first copy the code that we used in the last demo, and then I will extend it to, I will be using the extended code to in this new application. So for those of you who want to follow along, I will just go ahead and take the steps to create an app, and then we will walk through that while we talk about all the advanced features. So I'm going to create a new project. As I had explained, we would be using the console application, which is a .NET framework, not a .NET Core. .NET Core still doesn't have a very good functional UI, so you would not be able to sign in a user. So I will say create one. I'll call it my graph demo 5. Okay, and then I will navigate to the link I provided about the code that I'm going to use. So I have listed this prerequisite that you should be using a .NET Console client app. There is some command here that we will find useful when we are doing the notifications demo, but we can ignore it for now. We are going to add these 3 packages. So this is the Microsoft Graph SDK, the MSOL library, and the Graph Authentication SDK. So let me add these. When you add these, please remember to click the include pre-release checkbox if you are using Visual Studio, or you will not be able to find it as the library is still in beta. Okay, this will automatically add the MSOL library for me, so I'm not going to add it again. Then I'll go up ahead and add the Microsoft Graph SDK. Okay, so while this is going on, I'm going to go to my Azure AD tenant and create a new application that I want to use. While this is being done, I am going to start adding my code. These are the usings that we will be using here. And after that, I'm going to just copy the remaining code as is. Okay, then following the instructions, we would go to the portal again, and we will copy the client ID or the application ID first. I know the domain of my tenant is KKAD, and from the authentication tab, I'm going to copy the one that starts with MSOL. It's recommended for you to use. Okay, so looking back at this is simply an application that will make a number of calls using Graph SDK. And as I had mentioned earlier, as I would go through the various features, I'll explain how in the code this has been used. So I will first comment all of this, except the GraphMe example, and just make sure that the application is working as expected. So the one aspect that I did, I don't know if a lot of people notice, I have not bothered to, so you have to check this. Sorry, there is another statement I have. So you have to click the treat application as a public client as well, because this is an application that is being used as a console application. I believe this has been mentioned in the steps. Okay, I'll update the steps for this. Okay, so when in my application registration, I have not really bothered with setting up an API permission. This is the default permission that the portal adds when you create an application. I am relying on the default, the dynamic permissions aspect of Azure Active Directory to get me the required consent and the token for this application. So let me start the app. I will sign in as an administrator because one of my permissions requires the admin to consent. Sorry. Okay, so the call has worked as expected. So let's cover what we are going to cover step by step again. So we have an running app. In this first call, I will be using the Graph API to explore the navigational aspects of Microsoft's Graph. So essentially looking at my direct reports, looking at what groups I am a member of. And we just want to show you how it is, how getting all of this in your code is made super easy by simply using the SDK. So the methods that we have here, and I'm going to just expand this for you, is that we have the first method, which is called, which is named graph me example. So in this, I am making a call to the /me endpoint. So if you go to Graph Explorer, and sorry, I should have taken a view there. Let me restart this so we have a full show. Okay, so this is a call which is equivalent to the call that we have for /me, followed with we have a call to get all my direct reports. So if I say direct reports, here I get a list of people this user account has as manager, and these two are being combined here in a single call. So we actually ran this, so let me run it again for you. Okay, so it tells me who I am and the users, which is test user and test user 3 who are reporting to me in a single call. If you wanted to do it using, let's say, your own HTTP operations. Okay, that's I just saw that there is a good call here. So the way I do the verbose debugging is I use the Fiddler tool for this. And let me start this so that in the next example I would be able to walk you through how.
I know we can use Fiddler, but when we're working with databases, when we're working with other technologies, having it right there in Visual Studio in the debug console is so much more valuable.
Okay, that is also possible. So what you need to do is in your code, you can do request URL. This will give you the request URL that would be actually executed behind the scenes. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, although I would love a feature request where I could put in a configuration, a log configuration that would emit it verbosely by default.
Okay, that is a good ask to have. So, okay, then if you can take a note of it for me. So yes, so this is one example of how you could make things. And this is, I'm going to uncomment the next one, which is a call to member of. And before we go to this method, I will actually talk about the next feature that is available very well and is highly recommended that you use, which is pagination. So by default, Microsoft Graph will automatically start paginate results depending upon how a certain workload has set up pagination's property to be. So with every feature in Microsoft Graph that we will discuss here, whether it's pagination, it's about throttling, it's about notifications, the steps that you should be aware of as a Microsoft Graph developer is that you should always look at the API documentation for the settings that are available. So it could be the number of items in a page for, let's say, user entity could be just 20. For another entity, like I'm just making it a mail, it could be 50. And sometimes if you try to paginate using, let's say, top parameter that is available, I'll discuss it in a second, it might not always be respected for you. So if you are working with the raw JSON in the response, expect what looks like a @odata.next link. This is how it looks like. And you would have to, if you run into it, you should be looking for making another call to Microsoft Graph to get the next page. The last page would not have this list. Okay. Don't worry about what the content of the string is. Just execute it against Microsoft Graph as it is presented to you. Think of it as an opaque string. If you try to process it, this is not published as a standard, and we can change it if we wish, if we want, on a later day. Okay, this is my code that I have put here, which is the call to the member of API. This has one of the many patterns that we have made available, or that developers can use to paginate successfully in your code. So this is .NET SDK. So in this, to page through the result, I first look at the current page and go ahead and print the result. And then I look for another property called next page request. And if it is not null, then I go through that unless I see that the next page request has been set to a null. So it would be a null when the odata.nextpage link has not been provided in the results for me. So going back, this is the code here, and this is how you should write almost every method that processes results for Microsoft Graph, unless you're expecting something which is a single string value or a bool value. And let's just run this. Okay, hold on. Okay, would it be possible to show users login with Node.js, React, and MS Graph in one of the upcoming sessions? Okay, let's take that feedback.
I took note of that.
Okay, can we call the Graph SDK inside an Azure function? Azure functions, I know for sure. I am not sure about Logic Apps because I have not personally worked with it, but it's a .NET standard library. If you know how to get the combination of these SDKs inside a certain Azure function, you should be able to call it. So in the next demo, I'm explaining it from the notifications as a listener in a code, which would usually be an Azure function. And yes, it's very popular nowadays to use Graph SDK in Azure functions today. Okay, so I had deliberately created a number of hundreds of groups in my tenant, and if you could see that when I called the member of code, I have these groups listed by page number. So after the first page, it took almost 3 pages to list all the groups that my account is a member of. Okay, so let's move on. So that was pagination, and again, just every time you work with Azure SDK as a Microsoft Graph SDK, just be aware that your results would be paginated, and just write your code in with the expectation that the results will come back paginating, and that would make sure that your code does not break or worse, lose important results when it's needed for your app. So the next topic I'm going to cover is how to optimize. So when you start working with Microsoft Graph, this is very common that you start making calls like, let's say, I'm going to talk about this in the Graph Explorer. So you can start making calls like, just the user's endpoint. And after a while, what you don't realize is that developers don't realize that their application is making a lot of calls, and not just those calls are pretty heavy in terms of payload. So the user's endpoint, so for example, the V1 endpoint will give you these many attributes for a user. If you go to the beta endpoint, it actually is being developed to give a whole lot more output for every user now. So what happens is that if you are not careful, or if you don't think in beforehand the attributes that you need, or filter the results upfront, usually you would have an application that over a period of time starts to work slowly, or words would create a lot of network traffic. So for example, if I had used something like, let's say, so one good example is, okay, I am only interested in knowing the display name of the user and maybe their employee ID. So in that cases, I would suggest you use what we call as projections. So you would say display name. So this is the first way we advise you to optimize, is to choose the attributes that you need. So this is how you would reduce your calls. And on top of it, the other way that you should also use is say, okay, I am only interested in an employee, in a set of data which filters a certain filter criteria. So let me go back to my deck here. So use the select for projections, and this is an example that we give. You should also use something called as filters, which allows you to filter data based on how you want to, I'm going to just make it up, to reduce the amount of data coming in over the wire as well. So if you use the filter, so let me just make up something. Not a good one, but hey. So it didn't work for this case because I think it should be starts with Kalyan. But the point I'm trying to make here is use filters and use projections to limit the amount of data that you want to work with. Our documentation has some very good examples and details on how you should be limiting the amount of data. The filters are also very useful, is because if you want to look for a certain kind of a data, let's say you're looking for all the service principals for an application, you cannot go and find it today in Microsoft Graph unless you use these. In the source code example that I have provided you, if you go to another one, which is called a method like delta query example, this is a good example of how you use filters in pagination to optimize the amount of data that is traveling over the wire. So the select is available here as a method. Top is used for pagination, and you can also use filter here if you want to filter data with a certain parameter. So that was this. The third one that a lot of folks might not immediately realize is that you can actually add, let's say if you're carrying out, you can actually add headers which reduce the amount of data sent back to you. So for example, if you create a user, it will give you back in a response the details of the users created, including all the attributes. Maybe that's something that you don't want, is because it's a lot of data that you get back, but you don't necessarily need. All you need the graph to tell you that, okay, it's not an error, so you know that graph, the user was created successfully. In those cases, if you add this prefer return as is equal to minimal in the HTTP headers, you would be able to basically just get a no content response back from Microsoft Graph. Or if there is an error, it will give you a proper error. Okay. Any questions so far?
Nope, not at this time. We're good.
Okay, great. So going back, I will now start working on a new solution for you, which is to explain to you what delta query and notifications are. So let's cover the delta queries first. Delta queries have turned out to be very, very useful in terms of how, reducing the number of calls that are needed for Graph to maintain, let's say, scenarios where you have a copy of users in your tenant. Now, you can make calls to Graph and get the users all the time, or you can say, hey, I don't want to get all the users all the time. All I want is to basically get a change of that has occurred in my users DB on Microsoft side, and just Graph, can you just give me those changes? Can you give me all the changes in the groups? You know, when I made the last call, And I want to have all the changes to the number of groups added, removed, updated in terms of memberships. Can you give me just those changes? This is a very powerful feature of Graph. It's available as a Delta query. So and it's pretty easy to use. Again, when you use it, please make sure that you go and check the necessary documentation for the entities that you want to run Delta queries for. It is not supported by all the workloads yet. There are the obvious ones like users and groups and mails, which is supported, but a number of the entities are still adding support for it. We want to be in a position one day where it is available for all of the workloads, but we are not there yet. So the queries are essentially great for retrieving changes. Since you last requested them, we give you what can be termed as a watermark that you have to send us in the next call so that we know where to get the changes next from. The Delta query overview pages has the requested report says there is a function called Delta, and you have to store the watermark. It's provided to you as a Delta link in your store, so to enable you to make the next Delta call successfully. And you can use the select parameter to reduce the amount of data that you are looking for as changes. The demo for Delta queries is provided in this code. So the method is provided here. I hope everybody can see it. Here, what I'm doing is that I make a call and get all the users that I have in my tenant, and followed by a method where I go and note down this Delta link. So if you look at this method here, what it does is that it goes through the next page request, goes through all the pages available till it finds a property called Delta link. Once it finds it, it gets it back and it stores it here. Hold on. That we will use when we make the next call. So what we are doing here is that after we have listed all the users that we have present, we go ahead and add a new user in my tenant, and then I execute a set of code using my Delta link to find out if my Delta that the Microsoft Graph returns has those users that user created, and then I go ahead and delete that user for a cleanup purposes. So I will just leave it here so for you to run and test it yourself. So let's run it. Okay, so if you can see my screen, it first listed all the users that I have in my tenant. Okay, then when I press a button, it only shows me that one last user that I had added that was returned from the Delta query. It will take a lot of time for me to go through and look at the very specifics on how it works, but you can go and track these calls in a tool like Fiddler and get an understanding of how good it is. So if you have services that need to regularly sync data and changes from Microsoft Graph, please consider using the Delta queries, and you'll find it very easy to work with in general terms. The next topic that we will move on, is called Webhooks. What is a webhook? So this is a feature of Microsoft Graph which allows you to track changes on your side rather than you as a developer making Delta calls to get the changes yourself. The reason here is that it's often very difficult to figure out what is the optimum polling interval when you want to make calls to do your Delta queries. So sometimes you have been running your Delta queries for, let's say, every 5 minutes, every 5 hours, and you're never sure if you are going to get the amount of results, the number of results and the amount of results that you can process in the amount of time that is available. So to solve this problem, we have webhooks available for you. Again, go through the documentation to check how many entities supported today. It's not supported by every entity, and it will help you if you want to maybe if you find that there is an entity that you want to have support for, but it's not supported, please use our user voice page for giving us that feedback. Example scenarios are like, hey, we want to take an action when an email arrives in somebody's inbox, or maybe you want to start a flow when somebody has saved a document in OneDrive, or you want to go and create new users in your DB, or a provision in your application when a new user has joined in your organization. So the moment a new user record is written into Microsoft Graph, your webhook listener would get a notification with the object ID, and then you can make a call to Microsoft Graph and take the necessary details and take an action on it. Okay, the way it works is through subscriptions, and this is where things get a little bit more complicated. So the way it will work for you is that you have to first set up a listener. In our case, we will be using Grog to set up a listener in the local environment. How it happens is that you first send a request to Microsoft Graph to create a subscription. A subscription has the details like, okay, you want to monitor an entity called user, and you are looking for all the updates, or maybe you're looking for all the updates and deletes. So entity actions you want to monitor, and then you send a code. It's just a string. Why it is required is because the moment before creating a subscription, Microsoft Graph will, and one of the inputs is the endpoint where your listener will be present. The moment you provide these details to Microsoft Graph, the Microsoft Graph will call your endpoint back, and it will send that special string or secret that you had provided in your request, and you have to return a response of 200 OK. The moment you do that, the subscription is created. Now, the subscriptions don't last forever. They are usually, most entities will support a maximum subscription time, expiration time of 3 days. So the sample that I have provided you also has some code on how to monitor these subscriptions getting expired and renew them over a period of time. So once your subscription is all set up, you will start to get notification as data changes on the Microsoft Graph side of things. This is a list of supported resources that we have, but these slides have a habit of going out of date very soon. So please always refer to the latest documentation. So this is a flow that I already covered. Yes, you post a request to the subscription endpoint. And you will provide a validation token, which is just a random string. You will get a call back immediately to the endpoint. You have to respond with 200 OK. A subscription is created. You get a subscription ID, and your listener has to be available all the time. Okay, so this is example of if you want to do raw HTTP calls, this is how you create a subscription. You provide the name of the resource. You provide the type of change that you are interested in. The client state is that secret string or validation string that you want to provide to Microsoft Graph so that it calls you back with that to confirm that you are indeed who you are. And the notification URL, in this one, you can see that I'm using the ngrok provided URL to listen to my notification. And you will provide an expiration date time, which might or might not be respected depending upon how much time a certain resource or an entity allows as a max amount of time for a subscription. You will get a notification like this once your subscription is created. Again, lots of data to process here, but essentially what you're looking for is subscription ID, is because you can actually check Graph if you have, there is an API to check if you have a valid subscription ID or not. After this, so I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or 5 minutes doing a demo of webhooks. This is the sample that I would be using, and I will be running ngrok to set up my listener endpoint. So I will take questions after that. So let me just start setting up my, so I need to have a command prompt running. I'm going to need to change notifications.
And while you're sitting, sorry, there is an echo. There was a comment about the SDK suggestion to add an extension for is Delta Link instead of making us include the magic string in their code.
Okay, that's a good one.
So,
this is a great suggestion to place on the issues page of the Graph SDK team. So the last thing that I wanted to, one of the last things I wanted to cover was support for batching here. Batching was supported as a raw JSON calls for a very long time till just, I think, a couple of months ago, after getting a lot of requests from the developers on the Graph SDK GitHub side, the SDK team actually added a support for it. So I would say yes, if you could get a thread going on the issues page of the Graph SDK GitHub repository, it would be a good place to get us started. And I'll see if I can get something else pushed on. So I'm using this particular, sorry, I need to, let me make sure I don't. Okay, let me walk through the code as well so that we don't. So when you download that sample, if you go to the demos, you will go through to the third folder, which is called 03 track changes, and just open up the solution file here. Now, when you are, because this will run as an application, the things that you should be aware of when you are setting up a notification is that your application or a listener or your which will actually create the subscription needs to have a certain permission which allows you to do so. So for example, we are going to set up a subscription that will listen to users changes, right? So in the documentation for it, I hope it's open right here. When you create that, somewhere down the line, it will tell you, okay, so this is the length of subscription. And when you create it, it will also list the permission that you need. So for example, for my application to use the subscription and listen for users, I need to have configure, the users.read.all permission. So in this case, till now I had a user signing in, and I'm going to reuse my same application for my notification listener as well. So this is another thing that we want to tell you is that you can use the same app registration for multiple purposes, depending upon how the scenario dictates it. Again, it's an open topic to discussion. But in this case, because it's an application, it's an application that will sign in as itself, it will need app permissions. So we will find the user. We need the user.read.all permission. And because it's an application that will not be able to sign in a user or a tenant admin, we have to grant the necessary permissions from the portal itself. So we grant the permission as an administrator. And now this app registration is ready to be used in my new application, in my listener. So let me go back and finish this up. So in this particular demo, in this particular sample, if you go to the app settings file, so you have to set up this application first. So this is my previous setting. So I will just walk through it quickly and get us all going. The first thing we need is the application ID. So because it will authenticate as an application, so we need to provide a client secret that it will use to authenticate itself. Let's copy this. And in the overview, I can take the tenant ID. So my application is now ready to sign in. Now, because I'm hosting it over an HTTPS protocol, there is a command that I have provided on how to start Grog for your app. So what you need to do is go to the properties of this project, if you are a .NET developer, enable SSL and copy this port here, 44391. Then you use this in your ngrok command to set up a listener. So I will now start ngrok. Then when you have the ngrok running, go to edit mark, copy this URL and paste it in the app settings. That's it. That's all you need to do. So I will now run my listener. So the code here is basically all provided in the notifications controller. So it has two methods, get and post. The get one essentially is setting up the notification listener. So it sets it up as, so it uses the Graph SDK to create a new subscription. It provides a set of values, and it also has some code to basically monitor your subscription end time and renew it as it comes as it's ready for expiration. In the post for this listener, which is the URL that we provide, sorry, it's the same URL for both of them. Sorry, come again here. The URL for listener is also API notification, but we will get a post request back. We have two sets of code flows that you should pay attention to. The first one is that it looks for if the post has come back with a validation token. As you remember, as I said, when you're setting up a subscription, you have to provide a client secret or a validation token. If it comes back to it, it simply returns an OK response to tell Graph that it's ready to listen. And if it's not with a validation token, then it will actually go and process the request as it comes along here. So we will go to the output window, sorry, and make sure that we first set up the, okay, let me set up a breakpoint here to show you. Yeah, it's set up right. So the Graph has made a call back. This is the big string that I had provided to get myself ready. So set it up, and now a notification, okay, hold on, is set up. Oops. Let's try it again. So sure, let me just confirm if I have saved the permissions correctly. Oh, it says not granted. Sorry, there was something in the portal side that broke it. Let's try it again. We might have a token caching issue here, so this time it worked. So I'll quickly go back and make a few changes to my users because I'm looking at the changes to my users object. I'm going to make a change here in my users. A few of my users object, and I'll just say that because we are looking at all the changes that are being made, and so I've changed two user records, and Grog is a little hacky sometimes. So in the code, I have left a bunch of commands to let us know when our listener gets called back. So we might have already gotten that. I'll just leave it running and finish up the remaining slides, and then we'll come back to see if we have gotten a look at our notifications. So the other two topics are basically, I'll just walk through those. Throttling is something that you should expect always when you're working with Microsoft Graph. It returns a status code of 429, and the limits on read operations are usually much higher than write, but again, it's still expected. You can either write the code to handle it yourself, or you can leave this with Graph SDK. So if you have making a large number of requests to read and write with Microsoft Graph, use the with max retry option to ensure that in case of failures, your code is not broken. Instead, you get at least a number of times when you retry, and then you can log in the failure. What are the various errors that you get and how you should expect to handle them? So 403 is the most common. It probably has a consent issue, and you saw that in my current demo. I actually ran into those. Just make sure that you have permissions set up correctly. The second one is 404. It sometimes surprises, but maybe you are making a call to get the details of a user, and you are searching by the user's email or user principal name, but the user has not been really created in Microsoft Graph yet, either because there is a problem with AD Connect syncing users from on-prem AD to Azure AD or something else. Just back off and try something later. The 429 is a throttling error, very common. Just be prepared and don't be surprised. 503 is again rare, but it does happen sometimes when we have issue on our side. Very rare, but it will break your app. Again, use Graph SDK. It will keep you safe from these. The last one is batching. Sometimes you don't want to make individual calls and you would like to batch a number of calls. This is supported by Microsoft Graph and supported by Microsoft Graph SDK as well. The benefits are usual. If you look at the method in the first code, which is first solution, there is a method I have provided called batch request example, which tells you how to batch. The good thing here is that you can mix and match the number of the type and the resource and the type of calls. If you want to get a number of details of a number of users, and in the next set of calls you want to get a number of details, let's say delete a user and then go update another email or send another email, you can batch all of these in a one set and send it to Graph. The number of requests that you can batch is set to 20. So 20 is the maximum number. And in the response, if one or more of the requests fail, you will get a separate response for each operation when you get back. So this is the newly added support. The code is there for you to try out, and give it a try if you are a heavy user of Microsoft Graph. I'm going to go back and look at this again. It seems like for some reason we are not getting our notification. Okay, let's just stop and try again. Okay, while we're trying again, if there are any questions, I can take them.
Nope, not at the moment. The one got answered. Will the Delta tracking feature also be able to track changes to files and other OneDrive objects?
I need to set up a breakpoint here. Again, we have run out of time, but if you want to set up a breakpoint here somewhere, you can check that. I would finally just advise you to go through what we call as extending graph. This is a section. Okay, we got a notification. So it tells you the ID of the object, the user object that changed. And then upon this, it will not send you the entire object, just some basic pieces of information that you can use to track, you can use to make calls again to get the necessary details back from. So if a user has changed, let's say if we change their address or their job title, you will only get an object ID with a flag saying that this object ID was updated. Then you have to make the call to go and get the necessary details yourself from your code. So going back to this, the last topic was essentially extending graph. So there are two ways to extend graph. And the first thing, I will notice is why you would want to extend graph. Now, graph supports extension is because sometimes you would want to add data to an entity that is already available in graph. The most common scenarios are, let's say if you have a user and you want a property called employee ID, which is not provided by graph today. I'm just making this up, but you can do so. So you can go and create a schema extension to entities like users and groups. This will add those properties into on the users themselves. Then you can carry the post operations to populate the data in those extended attributes. Once you have done so, your data will become available in Microsoft Graph as well. There are two ways to go about it. One is called as open extension. It's an easy to use one, but it's not really typed data. So if you want to run filter queries if you want to run queries like, if I want to search employee by a certain extended property, it would not be possible with open extensions. If you want to use filtering on your extensions, then please use schema extensions. The details are covered here in a lot of details in the deck itself, which is shared with you. As I said, we have run out of the time, so I would not be able to walk through those. And please go through them. They're not really that difficult to understand. And that's pretty much all there is for me to present. Any more questions, or we can wrap up this session?
There are no more questions at the moment. So I think we're probably good. Just as a reminder, our next call for the identity platform call is on December 19th, the third Thursday of the month. And there was also on December 3rd, we do have a general graph call that this next month will be specific to the SDKs. And our SDK PM will be on that call if you have questions about that. And otherwise, here are all the different ways you can engage with us. The SlideShare link will also be, we'll get that out to everyone again. And have a great month.
Thank you, everyone. And
thank you.
There are references. There is a question about how do you create a test tenant. Here is the link. You can use it to get a fully functional, fully licensed test tenant you can use to test nearly all features of Microsoft Graph. Yeah.
And as an update, I do believe it's an E5 subscription now.
Oh, great. Awesome.
Yep. All right, everyone. Have a great month, and thanks for staying on.
Thank you, everyone.